So, friends, we should begin. My name is Donald Fisher. I'm the acting principal for this year, and we do expect an announcement very soon for the permanent principal who will start July 1 of 2024. First, let me recognize that we're on the unceded, traditional and occupied territories of the Musqueam people. And as I've said a couple of times already this year, it's significant that we say that. The land is, of course, enormously precious, and the process of reconciliation is a continuing one. The 2015 report was significant in of itself, and that group continued to report out on continuing investigations. The last report came out last year in 2022. And as many of you know, Monday is the first national holiday, Truth and Reconciliation Day. So with that, let me move on to a more general introduction. I should say, first of all, that it's great to see old friends back and new friends, I hope, who will keep coming to these sessions. All our sessions here are public and free, and everyone is welcome. So do keep coming, and also spread the word to your friends and family and anyone else you can think of. Tonight is a new series for this year, and the title of the series is The Russian-Ukraine War and Memory Politics. As I say, it's a new series. Natalia is the organizer, and she will welcome our guest tonight, and I'm sure it'll be a great talk. Thank you.
Good evening, dear guests, colleagues, residents in Green College, and everyone who joined the event online. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Green College for this incredible opportunity to present a series of lectures, The Russia-Ukraine War and Memory Politics. Since February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia has been going on. For more than 18 months, Ukraine has been fighting for its freedom, values, and sovereignty. Ukraine, which had been part of the Soviet Union till 1991, has gone through major political and social changes since then. This series of lectures addresses the issues of how conflicts and war are shaped by memory and how they affect the memory of people under attack. It's an honor for me to introduce our first speaker, my teacher, Professor Serhy Yekelchyk, who is Professor of History and Slavic Studies at the University of Victoria and President of the Canadian Association for Ukrainian Studies. He was born and educated in Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union. Serhy Yekelchyk received a PhD from the University of Alberta. He's the author of 8 books on modern Ukrainian history, Stalinism, and Russo-Ukrainian relations. His monograph, Stalin Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, was the recipient of the Best Book Award from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. And its Ukrainian translation in 2018 received a special diploma of the Lviv Book Forum. His survey of Ukrainian history, Ukraine, Birth of Modern Nation, was Choice Magazine's Book of the Year and went on to be translated into 5 languages. Professor Yekelchyk is currently working on the third considerably expanded edition of his well-known book about the Euromaidan revolution and Russian aggression in Ukraine. Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know. Professor Yekelchyk also has written opens for the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Politico. His interview credits include the BBC History Magazine, CNN, the New York Times, and numerous other international media outlets. Please welcome Professor Serhy Yekelchyk with a talk From a Memory War to a War Over Memory, the Past and Society in Ukraine and Russia during Soviet times and beyond. Dear Professor, the floor is yours.
This. Oh, perfect, the green light. Somehow on every campus these things are slightly different. Not much, but just enough to give you trouble. Okay, thank you very much, Natalia, for your generous introduction. Thank you very much, the college and the colleagues and the friends of the college and community members and all of you coming here tonight to listen to a conversation, hopefully, about what brings historical memory and present-day war together, in what way. It's my second time presenting in this wonderful atmospheric location, which is a pleasure to be in, not to mention a pleasure to be speaking in. And, you know, I also have a secret sign on my hand, which some of you would recognize, applicable for people with children who earlier today visited the science world. And so, you know, being on the island, on Vancouver Island at the University of Victoria, means that Vancouver itself for us is close and yet distant. It is part of us and yet it is different. So every visit here comes with inspiration and a new way of thinking about what I actually do there on the island, you know, quiet waters mostly. Until, of course, a major scandal happens in Canada about a Ukrainian veteran of SS Galicia Division. And then things are not as quiet. But thankfully, I'm in Vancouver, so they can't reach me for the comment. I'm not available. I'm talking to you instead, and I hope for me, for sure, it's going to be a much more productive and pleasant way of spending this evening. When we talk about memory and identity in this part of Europe, we tend to assume some things, and so do I. I also assume things. I assume, for instance, that in 1917, the Bolsheviks took power in the former Russian Empire and immediately started creating the new Soviet person. And that new Soviet person was kind of patriotic in a Soviet way, Russian-speaking also in a Soviet way, and basically united somehow with the entire cohort of other Soviet people. So it so happened that my research actually spans the 19th century and the 20th. And one big thing which I find myself very often thinking about is to what degree we can see the continuity across the 1917 divide. Whereas it was in fact true that in 1917 a major ideological change took place overnight, producing a new community, new people, and new type of memory. And then the answer to that, of course, has to be no. And that is because there is, first of all, the generational thing. There is a generation of people who are adults in 1917 who are not necessarily persuaded that the Bolshevik experiment is the best, and even those who believe in it in 1917, by the end of the Civil War in 1920, are perhaps disillusioned or dying of hunger, let's say. Right? Then, secondly, we do imagine Stalin's regime as monolithic, as something that atomized people. And yet, during the Stalinist census of the Soviet population in the late 1930s, 1/3 of the people actually claimed to be religious and churchgoers. 1/3 of supposedly atheistic, patriotic, communist internationalists are not afraid to tell the state that they actually go to the church, which basically marks them as aliens. Let's pretend they don't exist. They are not even there, right? And then, of course, there is a continuity of the state itself. Because when the Russian Empire collapsed, the Bolsheviks ended up letting some parts of it go. Poland, very notably, and there's a big story behind that. Finland, less willingly, but still. And the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they definitely didn't want to let them go, but there was the British Navy over there, firing its guns occasionally, just to send a signal. And so the Bolsheviks then lost significant parts of the empire, but supposedly they were about to create a new state in which the previously oppressed national minorities would be entitled to free cultural development and political rights. Did this actually happen? No. Already in 1920, Stalin, in multiple interviews and articles, stresses out that we, the Bolsheviks, have won the civil war because it was the Russian Civil War. Because we, the Bolsheviks, have the support of the core of the former empire, the European Russia. So he is not afraid to say that, in fact, it is good that Bolshevism is a quote-unquote Russian project, or so he claims. In the 1920s, however, the Bolsheviks, of course, go through a very interesting series of policies which, taken together, amount to affirmative action plan for the minorities. And there are two interpretations of it. One interpretation, you can find it very widely in Western writings, is that the Bolsheviks, being such a good-hearted people, they really, really wanted to help the oppressed minorities, and therefore they extended special measures to these minorities to allow them to, in fact, build their full cultures, receive education, and join government service. Well, there is also a second explanation. In the 1920s, the Bolsheviks were forced on a retreat. They had to acknowledge in 1921 that unless they give up on the extreme ideological plans, they are going to lose power. So they went for a series of concessions to the peasantry to acknowledge the existence of individual peasant households, to Western capitalism by extending concessions to the Western companies trading in Russia and the former empire. But also ideologically, they allowed the existence of, private cinemas which showed Hollywood movies. And the only thing which the Bolsheviks really cared about during this period was that, the cinemas are profitable. That's what they wanted. So it's a slightly different picture of the 1920s than the one we would normally assume resulting from the Bolshevik Revolution. So in this picture of the 1920s, then, any concession to the minorities of the former Tsarist Empire would actually fit right in. And it would not necessarily be an ideological gesture of goodwill, but it would in fact be a forced action. Because if we don't do that, we don't actually have a social base, so we need to do something. And so many minorities were also seen through the prism of social class. The peasants are all powerful. The Bolsheviks hate it, but the peasants are all powerful in the 1920s. They sit on the grain unless it is famine. They may sell the grain or they may not want to sell the grain to the state. The Bolsheviks see it as a blackmail. So part of the concessions to the peasantry was also not economic but ideological as well. And so the promotion of languages, for instance, in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, could also be seen not as a goodwill gesture of building a wonderful socialist nation, but actually as a concession to the peasantry. And then in this case, it would actually make perfect sense that the moment the Bolsheviks finally crushed the peasantry, that would be around 1932, 33, the collectivization ends, enormous casualties, millions dispossessed, hundreds of thousands shipped off to the Soviet Arctic, so Siberia, including one set of my great-grandparents. So my mom actually never met her grandpa and grandma on her father's side because they were shipped off to Siberia as supposedly rich peasants never to be heard from again. So this enormous violence breaks the back of the peasantry. The peasantry no longer can dictate because they are no longer private owners. All the private owners are in Siberia or dead. But still, as the Bolsheviks try to gather the peasants into the collective farms, the peasants do resist the forceful incorporation of households. They start slaughtering pigs. And so the number of pigs in the Soviet Union goes down dramatically, and then the state doesn't know what to do. Then the state is trying somehow to limit this to no avail, because it's like the last moment the peasant can actually make a decision before being herded into the collective farm. And the peasants do something really nasty. They consume. They actually realize that there are, tough times coming. And like in so many subsistence agricultural cultures, they in fact try to eat because they know they won't be able to soon. And so when Stalinism manages to crush the peasantry in general, including in Russia, it is particularly tough on the peasantry in Ukraine. Why would that be? Well, that's because the minority question in the mind of Stalin, and actually Lenin as well, but Lenin has a different strategy, a better one for him, is equated with the minorities question. It's the peasants. Once the peasants are under control, you don't actually have to give that many rights to the republics. You can limit them politically in what they do. You can start introducing the Russian language at school and checking every day how many classes in the Russian language you have. And then there is 1932 is the beginning of a major famine, a genocidal famine in Ukraine. And it's also the year when Stalin sends a telegram to ask, please report immediately how many hours of instruction in the Russian language your Ukrainian students are getting at school. So he suddenly woke up and, oh, wait a minute, famine is not enough, so millions would die, but I actually need to watch for this thing, for how much Russian they are taking at school. And so these two things become part of the same process. And then by the late 1930s, a very different Soviet Union emerges. The Soviet Union in which the supposed Bolshevik leaders committed to, classless society of the future with no racism, with equality, they actually acknowledge that the Russians, ethnic Russians, are the leading nation of the state. They are officially the big brother, the senior member of the Soviet family. And the moment you acknowledge this officially, 1936, is in fact the moment when you officially call yourself an empire. So here we go. The Bolsheviks spent 20 years arguing that the empires are the thing of the past. They're exploitative, they dispossess Aboriginal population, they do all these nasty things, and by the way, they always start wars because it is a feature of the empires. Well, but now, 20 years down the road, turns out that in fact it is the Soviet Union which has a very clear cultural hierarchy, who is number one and who is at the end of the list. And so in this particular scheme, Ukrainians as a group, as a nation, are getting a very interesting deal. But before I actually talk about them as a group, I have to say that they also existed as individuals. And as individuals, they could make very good careers in the Soviet Union, and for that matter, in the Russian Empire also. They could reach the highest rank in imperial table of ranks, that of Chancellor of the Empire. They could be prominent bureaucrats, field marshals, military leaders, party bosses, except when they assimilate, when they speak Russian. However, if they do position themselves as member of a linguistic community and cultural community, this is our land where we live, this is what language we speak, that is the moment when they start experiencing discrimination. They get arrested, they get pinpointed as dangerous nationalists, they get starved as peasants because they are a group. So here's a nature of that choice. And then within this hierarchical system in which there is a big brother, they get a very nice offer. They get an offer to become a second in command after the big brother. And this is actually officially expressed by one of the leading Soviet ministers, Vyacheslav Molotov, right after World War II. He comes to the Ukrainian Republic and gives a speech which contains one key sentence. After the great Russian people, Ukrainians were second to join on the road to communism. So the Russian people are great, the Ukrainians are not, but they were second, and not third, not fifth. And of course, there's a long list. And that is an extended hint. If you want to join us as a junior brother in running the empire, here is your chance. However, if you insist on your own rights against the empire, well, that is going to be eradicated by political means. So quite a few Ukrainians, individual people, professors, writers, engineers, but especially bureaucrats, thought that that was the moment. We join the hierarchy, we make it to the top of Soviet leadership, receive lots of stars on the shoulders, on epaulets and such. But of course, those who wanted to say, well, but wait a minute, what about the language, village grandmas speak? Is it going to die? Is it okay? Is it actually Marxism to let it die? Is it all in the name of progress? And that was the moment when they automatically ended up, they were basically excluded from the Soviet community, excluding themselves, essentially, from the Soviet community. Okay, so what's happening here needs to be complicated by yet another consideration. It never gets clear-cut, really. And that consideration is the fact that there is no clear divide across 1917. People do not overnight, wake up after the revolution and say, oh, it's wonderful, I'm a new person now. Like my grandma used to tell stories about growing up in St. Petersburg in 1917, and her story of the revolution was that the kids were not allowed to play outside for 3 days. And the private school she went to was not in operation for some time. Okay, that's one way of, one kind of optics. But of course, in that pre-revolutionary period, there already existed a certain understanding of the empire and the people within this empire. And in that particular understanding, Ukrainians occupied just exactly the same position right after the Russians, except under the empire, it was established in all the textbooks, and I don't normally make comments, but when it is your spouse, please, come on. So it's actually something very recognizable. That's what they had in the Russian Empire before 1917. We embrace you, brothers and sisters. Come here. Well, you have to leave your identity at the entrance door, but then you can come here. And so my point is, of course, that when Stalin brought back the notion of cultural and political hierarchy in the new state in the Soviet Union, he wasn't inventing something exciting. He was, in fact, telling the people, okay, we can now go back to that thing, which you know, and I know, and everybody knows, the way it was before 1917. Right? And so then there is a very interesting direct continuity there. Some people never even listened truly to Soviet anti-imperial rhetoric of the 1920s. They, in fact, went straight back to the Tsarist past. And so much of the Tsarist past worked under Stalin. All the great generals were now acceptable because they were patriotic generals. Wonderful. They were building a powerful state. This is also good. We are also building a powerful state. And so lots of things actually fit right in. Well, in order then to solidify this, the Soviet state called on historians, on my colleagues a few generations before me, and asked them to come up with really nice formulas. Like, how do you even express it that those people are second in line, second in command? And then one historian who was trained before the revolution said, oh, easy. It's all in the textbooks before 1917. So from now on, we need to introduce in every school textbook, and we need to organize lots of festivities, that in 1654, the Ukrainian Cossack state joined Moscow, soon to become Russia, soon to become the Russian Empire, and that was the wonderful thing. Because if you look at it from the Marxist point of view, that was pretty much colonial conquest and a conspiracy to enslave the peasants and exploit them even more. If, however, you look at this from the point of view of building a great state, that's wonderful, perfect thing. And so here we are. A historian trained before 1917 says, oh, there's a beautiful term for that. It's not annexation. It's not joining. You have to say reunification. And the state says, bingo, of course, reunification. And so in the late 1940s and early 50s, a curious term is introduced in Soviet history textbooks, and that is reunification of Russians and Ukrainians in 1654, in the 17th century. Well, some people make noises saying, like, what do you mean reunification? If we acknowledge that Ukrainians are a separate ethnic group, and we do because we have a Ukrainian Soviet Republic, because Ukrainians actually had created their own republic prior to that, which we had suppressed, and then we created our own republic. The answer is, no, you don't understand. The friendship and fraternal links between the Russian and Ukrainian people are of extraordinary nature, which is not encountered anywhere in the world where capitalism rules. Here, in our wonderful Stalinist state, you can reunify even if you are supposedly a separate nation. But everybody, of course, knew, because in 1917 divide, and because the generations are still around who went to school under the Tsars, the generations who remember church sermons of the Orthodox Church about the united Eastern Slavic Orthodox people who constitute one group. And so Stalin was not actually building a new imperial mythology. He was rehabilitating the pre-existing one. He knew it, and everybody around knew it. You just couldn't say it openly. Okay? So far so good. Then, of course, what do you do about the revolution? And the wonderful formula was found for that as well, that the Ukrainians were second to follow the great Russian people on the road to communism. That covers the revolution. So not only they helped to build the Russian Empire, but then they also were second in line in building the revolution. Wonderful, great. Okay, what about World War II then? Oh, actually World War II is complicated. Complicated because the Stalinist Soviet Union doesn't really want to talk about World War II after World War II. And this sounds counterintuitive to us because we are familiar with Mr. Putin's regime and insistence on us having won the Great Patriotic War and everything. Stalin didn't want any of that. He actually suppressed the holiday of the Victory Day. After just 2 years, it was no longer the day off, and all the celebrations scaled down because, you see, the contribution of war veterans would interfere with Stalin's own greatness. And he didn't want that. His gift of life, freedom, son, and heir to the people was universal. Nobody could stand between him and the people. And of course not the veterans. So the mythology of World War II was not created under Stalin after World War II. The Soviet state was too busy essentially suppressing any veterans organizations, kicking out disabled veterans from big cities, resettling them in boarding houses in the countryside so they don't spoil the picture of a wonderful Stalinist city. So and the Soviet Union really took its time processing World War II because there were so many things they didn't want to talk about. One of them was the Holocaust, interestingly enough. So the Soviet Union was in complete denial of one particular thing, of the specificity of Nazi terror against the Jews. So they acknowledged that the Nazis were evil, sure thing, that the Nazis were mass murderers, of course, but they just didn't want to say that the Nazis actually treated Soviet ethnic and religious groups differently and that the Nazis went in particular after that group. And so if you look at the Soviet documents from the 1940s and early 50s in particular, it's all about the Soviet civilians being killed by the Nazis. It's all about the Russians, Ukrainians, and Jews, when they're mentioned at all, they have to come third or even fourth after Belarusians. Because you see, it's the inverse of the hierarchy, of the imperial hierarchy. So if you are the main people of the empire, then you must be, by definition, the main target of the Nazis. Okay? So that's exactly what you encounter in those documents. And then there was, of course, the thing that the Soviet Union didn't want to talk about civilian casualties. It was not really included in the Soviet picture of the war. The civilians, they were there somewhere, they suffered, but they persevered. They're the Soviet civilians. Okay, we had famine before that, we are going to have another famine now, right after the war. They will persevere somehow. So they didn't actually want to acknowledge civilian suffering in general, but also because Jewish suffering was seen as a most prominent aspect of that civilian suffering. What they wanted to emphasize was the heroic actions of the soldiers, ideally primarily Russians, some of them Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians are also good. And that, of course, makes you think, what brings together Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and oh, wait a minute, isn't it the Orthodox Church? Yeah, so that's the old Stalinist, three nations coming together as Eastern Slavs, plus the wonderful Georgians who are also the same church, and also Stalin happened to be Georgian. So these are the ruling group of the empire, and of course they have to suffer most. And so you have this, accounts in newspapers where there's a mention of the Babi Yar, which is a major location in Kiev, where Jews were killed in this Holocaust by bullets. That's one of the worst, most infamous examples of that. And so the Soviets would, in fact, allow the people to mourn, but not specifically, not the Jewish victims, but all the Soviet victims, right? And so the denial of specificity was part of that kind of Stalinist universality. So you cannot take one nation and assign something to it. You cannot assign something to another one. And then there was a question, which still is not really addressed in some parts of the world, of collaboration. Because when the Soviets started running war trials, an interesting thing, they were really very early to start running trials of war criminals. 1942 already, two of them in 1943, I think. Why? Because there were disagreements between the Soviets and the Western allies about how to treat Nazi criminals and what parts of Nazi state and who will be criminalized. And Stalin was making radical proposals about, arresting or executing hundreds of thousands and things like that. And in this, in the process of running this early trials of Nazi war criminals, it turned out that they actually didn't have too many Nazis for the first one, but they were the local Russian collaborators. It was run in the Russian city of Rostov. And that left kind of a bad aftertaste. So we ran this wonderful trial to show to the Allies that we are going to be diligent and no criminal is going to escape, but wait a minute, criminals are our own people. That is not good. So by the time the war trial was held in the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine in 1946, only the Germans were tried. No locals. And the issue of the local collaboration was completely erased in the Stalinist Soviet Union because the Soviet Union actually demonstrated that all of its Slavic core, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, were prone to participating in structures that collaborated with the Nazis. And it is not something that you can, in Stalin's mind, acknowledge as a characteristic of the leading three groups in the empire. Russians had to be excluded completely from it. They still are. There are cases of a historian, for instance, writing a dissertation about General Andrei Vlasov, a very prominent Soviet military commander, who ended up collaborating with Hitler and organizing the Russian Liberational Army. So that defense was cancelled because we wouldn't want to know too much about Vlasov's army and how it really came together and things like that. So Russia, in its current form, in its present incarnation, prefers to imagine Russians as crystal clear Soviet soldiers who fight against the Nazis all the time, and they are never guilty of collaboration. Instead, that particular collaboration is assigned to everybody else. And once that was accomplished, when the cult of the Great Patriotic War was developing in the 1960s, by the 1960s there was a very vocal Ukrainian diaspora in the West, which in fact talked about the artificial famine in Soviet Ukraine, about the persecution of dissidents, some of whom were good Soviet people who just wanted to go back to what they imagined as Leninism. And the Soviet strategies for dealing with this information flows from the West were in fact rather elaborate. There is now a book about the KGB operation targeting in particular the Ukrainian Canadian community. So it was in these debates in the 1960s that the image is being developed of Ukrainians as different from the Russians somehow. Now, as a historian, there is a moment when a historian grabs some numbers and the numbers make this real and fact. So in terms of numbers, there is no reason whatsoever to claim that somehow Ukrainians were on the other side and Russians were on this side. Not at all. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians in World War II fought in the Red Army. So for them, for the overwhelming majority of families, the experience is shared, in fact, with other Soviet groups. There is no reason whatsoever on earth to claim that no Russian collaborated. Russians collaborated in colossal numbers, by hundreds of thousands, as police members, as voluntary helpers, as a Cossack brigades, and of course as General Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army. So as you see, history is diverse for all of these Soviet ethnic groups. But the effort to imagine ethnic relations in the present involves aligning them in such a way that the credit goes to the Russians. And somehow, for instance, Ukrainians are presented as quote-unquote Nazi collaborators. How is that possible? Well, easy, if you ask me. We are so accustomed, without considering the meaning of what we do, of calling the Soviet Union Russia, that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that somehow didn't make sense. So what do you mean Russia has left the Soviet Union? Wasn't the Soviet Union Russia? But Russia has left the Soviet Union. From 1990 to 1991, there were two presidents in Moscow, the president of Russia and the president of the Soviet Union. How could that be? They are the same thing. So this convenient shorthand which we use, and which we in fact need to stop using, effectively conflated the Soviet version of the Soviet history and World War II with the Russian achievement. It also meant that when the age of critical reassessment has arrived, other nations of the Soviet Union ended up reassessing the empire, reassessing World War II, reassessing collaboration. But Russians didn't have anything to reassess because they have inherited the imperial narrative unchanged. They basically inherited the imperial narrative from Stalin. Of course, it's not going to be easy and without problems. One interesting problem which came up, in fact, this week on the news. Just a tiny report on page 25 of Western media that somehow in the Chechen Republic all the textbooks of Russian history have been confiscated. Oh, wait a minute. Next report, next day. No, it's a mistake. They were not confiscated. Of course, we love Russia so dearly. Well, it turns out that if you embrace Stalinism as it was under Stalin, then the Chechens are evil traitors. They were, there was a genocidal deportation of Chechens from Chechnya, which still resonates with so many families, because allegedly they collaborated with the Nazis. The Nazis actually never reached Chechnya, but it's okay. Stalin felt that the Chechens were evil collaborators anyway. But the problem is, in present-day Russia, Chechnya has an outsized political importance. Mr. Putin relies on Chechen armed forces. When there was recently a mutiny, I'm sure you remember a recent mutiny, then the Chechen detachments were quickly flown into Moscow because they are the most reliable ones. So you see, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have the fully Stalinist version of history in which the Russians are always right, the Chechens are traitors, Ukrainians, of course, are traitors, everybody around traitors, we are the greatest. Oh, no, wait a minute. But the Chechens cannot be traitors because we rely on them in the present. And so this kind of the preservation of imperial memory, as you would understand very well, knowing our Canadian struggles with what our narrative of Canadian history is or should be, thinking also of the monuments, these recent developments in Victoria, where the statue of Queen Victoria was in fact vandalized with red paint in this wonderful quaint city of ours, right? So in this particular world, the Russian state is having difficulty fitting in and navigating. It cannot really say bad things about Stalin or the empire, but at the same time there are things that it cannot not acknowledge. This produces the most wonderful examples of political hypocrisy. So finally, after that many decades, Russia opens the monument to the victims of Stalinist terror, 2017. Mr. Putin shows up at the opening and gives a speech which lasts 30 minutes. And he doesn't mention Stalin once in this speech. So he speaks about Stalinist terror, but there is no Stalin in Stalinist terror because Stalin is good, fundamentally good. This is what the message of the authorities is. On whom then do you blame the Stalinist terror? Best answer is the Bolsheviks. Because the Bolsheviks, they ideologically came from Europe. They were the followers of Karl Marx. Everything that comes from Europe is evil. Therefore, the Bolsheviks were evil as well. But Stalin was good because he was a Russian nationalist, which he was. There's a famous conversation between his two kids, which one of them recorded in a book of memoir. Do you know that our dad used to be Georgian? And the other kid says, oh my God. Because, of course, in Soviet culture and media, Stalin is projected as Russian, which is ridiculous because he has a very, very strong accent, which is very trying for the interpreters. And by the way, the survival rate of Soviet interpreters from Stalin time is not all that good. Yeah, so if you constantly try to exclude something, to make a shortcut, to not discuss this and not discuss that, you essentially end up with a highly mythologized and familiar version which originates from the Russian Empire. And it fits on every level. Okay. You see, in the Russian Empire, there were two types of Ukrainians. The good Ukrainians, those living on the Russian side of the border. They were described as funny, cheerful, slightly lightheaded, irresponsible, but really good songs. Dancing is good. Beautiful women. Oh, men are lazy. The weather is beautiful. The land, they have this wonderful land. And you do recognize, right? Once these metaphors of colonialism are kind of accumulating, oh, that's so familiar. Okay, lazy men, beautiful women. Okay, I see. They need to be civilized. Of course they need to be civilized. So that's the kind of discourse you get in the Russian Empire towards Russian Ukrainians. So they can be part of us if they're educated properly. But the problem is that there were also Ukrainians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And those were the most evil Ukrainians, really, the most evil. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had political participation. It had a parliament and legislatures in the crown lands. People could get elected. The empire recognized 12 official languages, 16 in some other situations. It had regiments organized by ethnicity, where officers assigned to the regiment had to study the language of the regiment. You can only imagine if the language was, let's say, Ukrainian. And so some Ukrainians came from this other experience. And when these two Ukraines met together in 1917, it was a shocking meeting for both sides. Because those people from the West kind of, oh, I served in the parliament for 2 terms, like I'm a brilliant lawyer, blah, 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 blah. I know how to do things. And they was like, oh, we are school teachers, we are not allowed to teach our language, we are all oppressed. We think socialism must be good, maybe, but maybe not. So they kind of meet and they, really? So are these people also Ukrainians? They don't like each other at all. That's the story of the Ukrainian Revolution in 1917, by the way. And so the Soviet Union also inherits the bad Ukrainians, who do not see themselves as the junior brother of the Russians. That's so easy. And then, you know what? It also worked for the Jews. Same thing. In the Russian Empire, there are all kinds of limitations. You cannot reside in big cities unless you have university education. Well, try getting it. Unless you are a doctor, unless you are a merchant of the first guild, which means you are immensely rich and such and such. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. But of course, World War I begins, and there are actually Jews on the other side, on the Austrian side, who have civil rights. And then in World War I, Austrians and Germans saying that, the Jews of the Russian Empire are probably going to sympathize with us because some of our army soldiers and officers are Jews as well. And they have, civil rights, with one exception, a really important one. They cannot be an officer commanding Christian soldiers, which is a big issue in the Austria, and especially in Germany. But nevertheless, there are big issues in the Russian Empire not getting killed during the pogrom, for instance. And so it works that there is a good group of the Jews and there is a bad group of the Jews out there. And it also works for Stalin. Because Stalin, as far as we can figure out, he doesn't really like Ukrainians. He feels that Ukrainians are kind of funny, dancing, singing, whatever, picturesque shirts embroidered in some way, fine. But they can be good Russians if they get education. And he's probably privately anti-Semitic, but he has a very reliable Jewish minister whom he likes a lot and trusts him a lot. Who is a big guy, who is famous for destroying telephones after he yells at some official saying, you have not delivered 25 trains of grain, crushing the receiver on the phone, and then a new phone has to be brought in. That's Stalin's favorite Jewish minister, Comrade Lazar Kaganovich. So there is this ambiguity then, but then there is a moment when it turned out that, okay, there are Soviet Jews, there are some issues with them, maybe they can be made good Russians, maybe. We're not quite sure, but maybe. But there are also evil Jews abroad. And so that moment comes, the State of Israel is created in 1948, and the Soviet Union is in doubt how to deal with the State of Israel. I will be done very soon. Because you see, the Israeli ambassador arrives into the Soviet Union, and there's a huge crowd shows up to greet the Israeli ambassador, who was, of course, born in Kiev, Ukraine. And then the Soviet officials realized, oh, wait a minute, but our entire perspective on our Soviet Jews is now going to be determined by the knowledge that there is Israel, which we thought would be a nice socialist state, but which is now becoming more capitalist and such. And so the Soviet Jews end up in all kinds of troubles because they are now seen as belonging, as being loyal to that other group abroad. And that's exactly the same with Ukrainians, because Stalin brings in the former Austrian Ukraine, and that actually makes entire Ukraine unreliable, because you infected this body with this element which knows something about politics and such. So, with this kind of memories, is there a road forward to the people of the former Soviet Union? Well, and I would argue that yes, but it requires first coming to terms with the empire. And then it requires acknowledging the new political community. And in recent decades, Ukraine has made huge progress on this very road. So when the Ukrainian-Russian war started in 2014, sociologists, it was a small-scale war for quite a while. Sociologists were able to poll the population on both sides of the front line and figured out that there was no difference really in culture or the language spoken, which was overwhelmingly Russian, or the education, and the only thing which differed was actually the attitude to Stalin, because those on the Ukrainian side were way more likely to see Stalin as a bloodthirsty tyrant that he was, and those on the side of so-called separatists supported by Russia felt that Stalin was a great leader. And here it sends you right away an important signal. The imperial past has not been processed on that other side, but it is very much in the process of being processed on the Ukrainian side, because people are finding out about the famine, finding out about all kinds of other things. On the other side, it is remaining unprocessed for a variety of reasons. Secondly, do you create a new community? For some time in the 90s, it seemed that Russia was on its way towards creating this community, but it was a feeling which didn't last for too long. Whereas Ukraine, just take a look at the most recent revolution of dignity, which started with a Facebook by an oppositional journalist by the name Mustafa Naim, who obviously is not Ukrainian, an Afghani refugee, who did not even speak Ukrainian at the time when he started the most recent Ukrainian revolution with his post. So if an Afghani refugee not speaking Ukrainian can start a Ukrainian revolution, it actually tells you that this revolution is produced by a new political community. And it is that particular community which confirms its existence by electing a Jewish president without his Jewish identity ever being raised, not even once, during the campaign, which is quite unprecedented. So this is the direction forward. But there is also the direction, of course, backwards. And it's very much present in Mr. Putin's strategic thinking. So if you see everything through the prism of Stalinism, if you pretend to be fighting World War II over and over again, but actually if you read a Russian history textbook, you would have serious doubts on whose side the United States and Canada and the UK were actually in World War II. Because one of the impressions you would get from the Russian history textbooks would be, well, they were not really with us. They were really with the other guys. And so in the symbolic world of popular culture, the West is suspected of not really being on the same side. And it was the great Russia which won single-handedly World War II. So if you go on and you constantly deal with the issue, we don't want to acknowledge deportations and genocide under Stalin, but we cannot insist on them being included in the textbook because our own Chechen guards would not guard us anymore, and then our dictatorship would collapse. That means you're so fundamentally stuck in the past that you don't even have to start with the question that this is authoritarian past, or perhaps even totalitarian past, in which human rights don't completely matter whatsoever. But it's even in terms of imperial and ethnic past, it is so troublesome that you see a trend in recent years in former very friendly countries, such as Kazakhstan, for instance, to switch to a different alphabet, to argue that there was a famine in Kazakhstan. There was actually a terrible famine in Kazakhstan, where millions died as a result of Stalinist experiments with or if you cannot deliver grain because you don't grow wheat, deliver meat. Oh, but meat is your livelihood because you are nomads. Okay, you deliver meat and then you die. Oh, no, wait a minute. You have to die in your own republic. If you try to migrate to China, as you have been doing for millennia, we are going to kill you with machine guns and grenades. That's the story of Kazakhstan in the 1930s, right? So then there is this thing, suddenly you hear Kazakhstan switching to a different alphabet. Suddenly you hear Kazakhstan talking about the Kazakhstani famine of the 1930s, which in fact preceded the famine in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so it means that, well, the past exists. It is complex. We are here to address it critically. We need knowledge, and as it now turns out, Canadian politicians definitely need more knowledge of Ukrainian history. Yes, I'm sorry to say, because what they in fact what in fact happened was that Fox News was running this as the number one, the prime news of the day, like the biggest on the website of Fox News, that Zelensky and the Nazis, kind of because they really long wanted to connect Zelensky to the Nazis, because it's what Putin does in every talk. And of course, there is an interesting synergy between Fox News and Mr. Putin's pronouncements, which would perhaps call for the investigation of financial flows, or maybe some compromising materials on Mr. Trump. Or I'm not even sure what can possibly determine such a wonderful synergy there. Yeah, so there is a past. We need to address it critically. We need to address it from the position of the present, that the supreme value is human rights, democracy, acknowledgement of the past wrongs, reconciliation. And if you are in the process of doing this, and you are facing somebody next to you saying, no, I refuse. Instead, I'm going to invade you. Because that would preserve that particular neighbor's system of the world intact. Because you can still live in this wonderful Stalinist past. And so it turns out it is actually a war about history. And it is a war about memory to a very significant degree, because these things are connected with our political choices in the present. There's logic to me in saying that, well, if you like Mr. Putin, then you're also probably going to like Mr. Stalin. And so your history textbook is going to teach you to like Stalin, because we expect you to love Putin, right? So if you have a Jewish comedian showing up as president, then you're probably going to say, well, you know what? Presidents don't really matter most of the time, until that moment when they can, we need to rise to the challenge, and suddenly a little guy, Charlie Chaplin kind of charisma, could become a great leader. But for the most part, if you have an active civil society, if you have people believing that they can do things because they organized 3 revolutions in 30 years, then it doesn't really matter who your president is. Okay, so this is where I'm going to stop, to drink some water and collect some questions.